Well, I'm Aaron Ironside, and thanks for joining us for this from the SAYNOPETODOPE campaign as we lead up to the general election on September 19, and of course, one of the two referenda that we'll be asked to vote on. Today, we're talking about the cannabis referendum, where we'll be asked whether or not to legalize recreational cannabis. I want to always emphasize that it's the word recreational we're talking about. Medicinal cannabis was legalized in New Zealand last year. It's very hard for us to anticipate what might happen if recreational cannabis is in fact legalized, as the law proposes to do. We have to look overseas to get some kind of hint, glimpse at what the future might hold for us. Smart Approaches to Marijuana, SAM, in the US, is an incredible group who have been researching this very topic, both for the American and Canadian politicians, and we thought it would be very helpful to ask SAM what they thought about the New Zealand legislation and what might happen if recreational cannabis is legalized here. So joining me today from SAM is Will Jones. Hi, Will.
Hey, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you with us. Tell us what brought you to this topic. Of all the things in life that make your cause, why this one?
Honestly, because there were not a lot of people speaking out on this issue, especially from communities like mine, about the impact of legalization and commercialization. It's an issue that unfortunately has become very polarizing, and one where unfortunately also I don't think people give deep thought to the breadth of policy positions that are available for this issue. So often people get pushed in a category of either supporting legalization or arrest and incarceration. And honestly, I believe both of those are extremes when we're talking about marijuana policy, whether they're talking about commercialization or incarceration. And so really want to see solutions pushed forward that are between those two extremes. And that's a space where there's not a lot of people talking right now. It's something very personal to me because I have family members that have been impacted by marijuana use. And I also live in a community that has really been exploited by big tobacco in the liquor industries in the past. I tell people all the time, if I walk out the front door of my house in any direction, the first store that I'll get to is a liquor store. And if we go a little bit farther, I'll get to a convenience store, but it'll be so covered with advertisements for tobacco, liquor, and the lottery that you can't even see inside the windows of that store. So I don't want us to go down a path with marijuana policy that repeats the mistakes of the past.
Well, let's talk about some of those supposed benefits for vulnerable communities. Now, at this point, of course, American culture and Kiwi culture in some levels very different, but in others, we both see that, unfortunately, communities of colour are overpopulated in our prison system, for instance, perhaps for different reasons. But certainly those advocating for the law change here suggest that if cannabis were legal, that somehow this would address the issue of racial targeting by police. Now that seems to me unlikely, in that I would have thought the only thing that stops the racial targeting would be a change of heart and attitude in the police officer, and that I can't quite see how removing one thing that they can investigate is going to necessarily do that job. Do you think it's enough to change those terrible outcomes where certain communities feel like they are being targeted?
Yeah, and you're right. I agree with you on several things you said there. First, that the United States and New Zealand are different places. And so I haven't been there yet, but I'd love to. I was planning to before all of this coronavirus stuff happened. But at least as it pertains to the United States, and you could speak more specifically to how it is there, but where you mention it's an issue of the heart. That is so true. And especially in the United States, we're talking about a place where for years, centuries, discrimination and prejudice against people of color was enacted. And we've just begun to be seeing changes that have needed to happen for years in our country. And so the idea that legalizing and commercializing a product is going to deal with those systemic injustices and those systemic inequalities within our nation, I tell people I believe that's naive at best, if not outright appropriating issues of systemic injustice for personal gain and personal profit. And what I mean by that is that we can and should decriminalize, so remove criminal penalties for marijuana use. Someone should be arrested or sit in jail for smoking a joint. I don't think anybody wants to do that, frankly. And so if we're being serious that we're focusing on this for criminal justice reform and for social justice reasons, then that would be an avenue that we would explore, and we should explore, I believe, removing criminal penalties for personal possession and use. However, when we talk about commercializing, that allows a whole industry of advertisements, of stores, billboards, TV ads, magazine ads. All of that is what comes into play when we talk about legalizing and commercializing. And we know that that system exploits vulnerable communities, disadvantaged communities, and impoverished communities. They have a history of doing that here in the U.S. As I mentioned earlier, the liquor and tobacco industries have done that. It's been in their documents that they targeted communities of color. Now they've invested billions of dollars in a new industry because everyone knows, for example, smoking cigarettes is bad for you. So they, like anybody, they don't want to lose money. They want to keep their business viable. But now they're looking at another product line, and it's marijuana, cannabis, whatever we want to call it, and that's looking very promising to them. And so I challenge people and I question people: why would these companies magically change their marketing practices just because they have a new product? And that's why I say it's really appropriating issues of systemic injustice and inequality to create revenue for themselves. Again, if we want to focus on criminal justice reform, let's focus on decriminalization, removing criminal penalties, and expungements for those who may have it on their record. When we talk about commercialization, that's a whole nother issue.
When we talk about commercialisation, the proposed law here in New Zealand wants to make some special allowance for Māori people to be able to be involved in that commercial market, and yet many Māori community leaders don't believe that that will happen, that those who are currently growing and selling, often through the gang system, are unlikely to become the legal sellers. And when I watch the documentaries that are being produced about the legalisation of cannabis, I note that the owners of stores are typically white. They're very rarely people of colour. It doesn't seem very often that a gang leader decides to go legal.
Yeah, I mean, I can only, again, speak to what I've seen happen here in the U.S., but definitely it's been primarily white males that have benefited from a monetary perspective from legalization here in the U.S. Even places where they said it was for social justice and they wanted to have equity initiatives and all these things, like Chicago, Illinois, where they legalized recently. When they started, there were no people of color that were in the industry, zero. And that's not unique to there. There have been other states that have tried it, and it's less than, or I should say over 80% of people in the industry in the U.S. are whites that are reaping the benefits of this. And in some states, it's as low as like 2%. Some states that have legalized, it's as low as 2% people of color that are in the industry. And so this idea that the revenue aspect of it is supposed to, what people say here in the U.S. is it's supposed to reinvest in communities harmed by the war on drugs. That's not something that's played out as of yet. And again, I would look at other industries and say that I have no reason to believe that that's magically going to change with cannabis. Again, we can look at the tobacco industry and the liquor industry, which are heavily taxed here in the U.S. I look at communities like mine, communities of color in major cities, and say, where is all the reinvestment that was supposed to have happened from these industries in our communities? Our communities are still underfunded in terms of education, healthcare, so many areas. If, taxing an addictive substance was going to substantively change our communities, I think we should have been able to see that by now, but it's not played out. In fact, what happens is, again, disadvantaged populations are preyed on by a commercial industry with predatory marketing practices, and they bear the brunt of unfortunately, substance use that turns into addiction for many people and has health consequences associated with it.
Yeah, it seems like this legalization is premised on a kind of a shaky ground. The idea being that this regulated market that will appear will somehow cause gangs in the black market just to throw their hands in the air and say, well, that's it. We'll give up growing and selling cannabis. We're done. You've got us. And yet it seems that what really happens, of course, is that once the new business has to deal with compliance costs, being able to have facilities, overheads, once they have to pay tax on the product and just the general goods and services tax, that the end product will end up being a lot more expensive than the black market variety. I mean, is it even true that in vulnerable communities that people will even go to these shops, or will they keep going to the black market like they always have?
I mean, there's of course some people that will, avail themselves of the stores, but what we've seen in places like Canada, in California, and other places that have tried that here in the U.S. is that often it is still cheaper on the black market to purchase your product, and it's specific to cartels, and multinational cartels that many people say, well, this is why we should legalize it, take it out of their hands. One reality that we have to think about is, first, that this has not been, their primary source of income for, multinational cartels. It's been shown to be, between 15 to 25% of their revenue, depending on, which organization they're looking at, and those are rough estimates. But what are they replacing that with? And there's some indication from some government sources that they are replacing marijuana with harder drugs. So they've lost some revenue from selling marijuana. And again, like any business person, they're not like, well, we're just going to lose our revenue now. They're branching out into other areas. And so, again, it's kind of early to conclusively say that this is the case, but there is some indication that cartels are now running harder drugs, which may be related to some of the rising drug problems we're seeing here in the U.S., but they're selling those products now that they've lost some revenue from selling marijuana. So that's another aspect that we have to be aware of. But at any rate, as you say, cartels and whatnot, they're not going to all of a sudden change and become legal businesses because marijuana has become legalized. There's no indication that that has happened. And here in the U.S., states like California have actually seen an increase in black market activity since legalization. In fact, California called in the National Guard to help deal with some of the problems on federal land in national forests, where they were seeing these huge grows with pesticides and all these types of things that are contaminating the environment. So in some states, it's even been an increasingly worse problem since legalization.
Talk about the flow-on effects. Whilst we know that, for example, if you use cannabis for the next couple of hours, you might not be very likely to be violent. It does seem, though, that the flow-on effects in terms of things like poverty, when you've been using the family's money to purchase cannabis, that things like conflict and violence might happen at other times. And there are other flow-on effects to the children who are growing up in homes where the money that's supposed to be used on food is being used on things like cannabis. I mean, what are the flow-on effects that happen in vulnerable communities?
Yeah, and I would say this doesn't just happen in vulnerable communities, but it probably impacts vulnerable communities the most. And that's because when you have less resources and you're spending it on, something like substance use, that's going to much more negatively impact a lower income family, and also a family that might not have as many other social resources to avail themselves of if their use slides into addiction. And I would say that with cannabis, those issues that you just mentioned, there's nothing unique per se about marijuana in this respect and how it can impact users when we're talking about drugs. It's cannabis use disorder is what it's called now, the category. And with any use disorder, whether we're talking about alcohol or some other drug or medications, what have you, it begins to infringe on normal, and this is what makes it a use disorder, but it infringes on normal activities that you would do, how you'd be around your family, how you prioritize your work or your education. It becomes something that becomes primary in your mind, and your focus is towards using and obtaining that substance. And the same thing can happen with cannabis. Some people say that it's not addictive, but that is not true. All the science and research shows that it can. The chances is 1 in 12 about if you're an adult, 1 in 6 if you start in your teens. And so it's like many other drugs that many people slide into substance use disorder, and it has a negative impact on their lives. And as I mentioned earlier, where it's particularly damaging for vulnerable communities is that you don't have the infrastructure and the other resources to, if you lost your job, then to get another one, or if you got kicked out of school, then to get into another great school, because your social network is able to take care of those things. When you're in a lower income community, you don't have as many of those options available to you. So the consequences of substance use and disorder fall even heavier in these communities. And the other thing I would mention, and this is what really concerns me, is that you're in a lot denser housing and living when you're in a lower income community. A lot of people live in apartments, in high-rise apartments. And so for the individuals that choose to use, a lot of times they're exposing a lot more other people to their use. And so a lot more people are getting the negative health impacts, whether it's from secondhand smoke or even children in the homes. That's another thing that I've seen firsthand as a first responder here in the US, where I go into these apartment complexes, the hallways are filled with cannabis smoke, the apartments are filled with cannabis smoke, and there's all these kids crammed in these small apartments that are subjected to that. And we know all the science and research shows that it is damaging to young brains when they're inhaling at a young age. And so that's another consequence that we have to be aware of.
Well, finally today, I want to talk about this false choice that you mentioned at the top of the interview, this choice that our only options are to throw people in jail or to let them all out of jail and say this is just a health issue and nothing more, as if there are no points sort of in between. Now, certainly when it comes to our referendum, as a nation, we're just simply being asked, effectively, is legalisation better than prohibition? Because those are the only two options being put in front of us. But many people are asking us, well, are there third options? Are there other things that could be done that would be more effective? And that's a really great question.
Yeah, and our organization, Smarter Purchase of Marijuana, that is what we talk about everywhere we go, that this false dichotomy is set up between incarceration and commercialization, something a lot more reasonable. And I hope that we as a society would be interested in choosing reasonable options, would be something targeted specifically at removing criminal penalties for substance use with marijuana, so that, again, if someone has a joint, it's not going to throw them in jail and disrupt the rest of their lives. But there are health options for those that are that may have slid into addiction with their use, and that it's much more treated as a health issue than as either a criminal justice issue or an issue where addiction is exploited for profit. Again, those are extremes on the spectrum of policy options that we have available to us. And so that's what we encourage people to, that we believe that we should be exploring policy down this route. An example of a country that's done this, and, we don't recommend what they did, exactly, but a decent model that we refer to is Portugal, where, again, they do not have Philip Morris and alcohol companies, Heineken, Molson Coors. These are industries, by the way, that have invested in cannabis here in North America, but they're not selling products in stores. They decriminalize use, and they have a system that they set up for not just marijuana use, but substance use in general. And that's a much more reasonable approach than opening the floodgates to big tobacco companies, liquor companies, and other industries that want to exploit and create a new industry of addiction for profit.